recipient of 14 awards from the Illinois State Historical Society and is currently developing several large-scale historical projects. So please help me welcome Tom Emery.
I'll go to it. My name is Tom Emery. I'm a freelance writer and historical researcher from Carlinville, Illinois. I know I have to ask all my audiences, you ever heard of Carlinville? You know where it's at? You heard it's at? What do you know about Carlinville?
Pardon?
What do you know about Carlinville?
Other than it's down south quite a ways.
That's
I don't know whether you consider yourself south or whether you're still.
Hey, it depends on how you say it. Well, I consider myself central, but a lot of people call us south.
Well,
So
I know
yeah,
that. Up
yeah.
here we call anything.
In downstate,
just
yeah,
down,
yeah.
downstate.
We're down there. I'm 260 miles away from home today. I'm 45 miles south of Springfield. And I always have to laugh about this because when I come up this far, nobody's ever heard of Carlinville. I get a kick out of that. Because I have the privilege of going around the state doing these types of engagements. I've done about 170 of them in the last 12 years. I've been as far north as east of Butte. I've been as far south as Harrisburg. I've done 12 in Cook County. Last September, I did a series of 4 in Kansas City. So this is something I really, really enjoy doing. I've, like Saudi said, I've been in 150 newspapers. I've done 37 booklet titles, including the one we're going to be talking about here today. I should mention about Carlinville. This gets people's attention. We're a town of about 5,200 people. We've been that for the last 100 years. I'm on the board of the Carlinville Public Library. We have 7,400 square feet there. We're pretty proud of that compared to this. This is a gorgeous library. It really is. Y'all have every reason to be proud of it. We had the only stoplight in Coupon County for a number of years. We've now got 4 out of the 6, so I guess it's progress for you. But this is a program that I've developed 5 years ago with my book, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. This is one of 2 books I did for the Illinois Bicentennial in 2018. I was also involved in a 3rd publication. It's a compilation of articles I've done on women's history. I have 22 top Illinois women of various occupations who are either born in Illinois, lived most of their life here, or left a large imprint in the state. I limit it mainly to women, mainly from the 19th century, who were born in the 19th century or thereabouts. So in case anyone's wondering why I didn't include recent women, well, that's why. You know, why'd I do this? Well, this is something I feel very strongly about. History belongs to all of us, regardless of age, sex, income, or level of education. History belongs to me, and you, and you, and you, and whoever's walking by, and anyone's walking on the banks of the Fox River today. You know, it belongs to all of us. I feel very strongly about that. History does not belong to people who just have money or have advanced degrees or anything else. It's all of us. It's all of us. It's ours. And professional historians are really missing the boat on that one, I think. Women's issues are too often overlooked, as our women have an interest in history. When I came up with the idea of doing this book, I started looking for similar publications because I want to make a difference in history, but also I'm trying to sell these things too, to be honest. There were 3 books on women's history done similarly to this before. I didn't think they had as much value as they could have, and I felt like I could make some type of contribution as well. Women have an interest in history. That's another area that I feel very strong about. The strongest figure in my life was my mother, Jane Addams, who's actually enjoying your library today. She came up here with me today. I'm an only child. It's just been mom and me for a long time. I like to say I'm a mama's boy and damn proud of it. You know, mom's been great to me. She loves libraries and she's having a great time here today too. But she raised me to respect and understand everybody. And I've carried that in my daily life. In my professional experience, I've done this. I've been a college sports information director. I've written all these articles. I've done these lectures. I'm proud to say that no one's ever accused me of ignoring women's issues. When I was in SID down at a Division III school, no one accused me of ignoring Title IX. I don't get any complaints saying I don't write enough about women or don't treat women's issues well enough. The emails, the majority of emails I get from readers are women. My book sales are women. And this is not unusual, seeing mostly women audience today. A lot of my audiences, no matter what program I'm doing, are 80, 90% women. That's not big, so you're the loner here today, but yeah. That's not unusual because it doesn't matter what program I'm doing. It's not a bit unusual for the audience to be 80% women when I go places. I'd like to tell you I had a really deep and spiritual moment when I came up with this idea. There's a backstory to every book and how it came about. I'd like to tell you I had a really deep moment. I'll tell you how I came up with this. I'm a lousy sleeper. I don't sleep well at all. I've been awake this morning since about 2:45. You know, I just don't sleep well at all. So what ends up happening is I'm laying in bed most nights, my mind's going, and of course that just defeats the purpose, you know, I can't get any sleep after that. But it was in July of 2017, I woke up at 2 or 3 in the morning, whatever it was, and I'm always thinking about new projects, new articles, new books I want to do. I've got so many things I want to do in my life because it's such a big world and history's so big, so many things to write about. And I got thinking that women's issues were at the front at the time, as they remain today. And I got to think, well, I've written an awful lot about women's history in my life. I've written a number of articles, I've done a number of different things on it. I might make a book. I got to think about that laying in bed that morning, and that's how this book came about. Literally. So I'd like to say it was a really deep and special moment, you know, like an epiphany. No, I just couldn't sleep one day, and I got to think about this book, literally, and it brought us here. Because it's been one of the most interesting books I've ever done. It's been one of the more interesting, I'm not saying that Ultra's interesting, but the reaction I've got to it has been quite interesting. Some of the audiences I've had and some things have been said to me. It's been quite an experience. And if you notice right now, folks, if you have a question or comment, put the hands up, because we don't stand on formality here. You probably figure that out by now. Why are these women notable? Why are they remarkable? One reason, I think the biggest reason, because everything they overcame. There's no question that women today struggle with gaps in pay, education, advancement, opportunities, legal opportunities, legal treatment, respect. We're not going to argue that. It's truth. But 50, 80, 100 years ago, women had it even worse. It was even worse back then. The level of sexism, ignorance, condescension, oppression they face is hard to comprehend today. And let me tell you a story about this, because this is a point that millennials have a really hard time with. They don't quite get this. And I'll tell you a story about this. The first time I did this presentation was on June 2nd, 2018, at a meeting of the League of Women's Voters in Edwardsville, Illinois. Edwardsville is a suburb of St. Louis, home of S.A. Edwardsville. Most of the women in that audience were in their 60s and 70s. And when I made that statement that women had it worse back then, it was harder, you know, even worse than it is now, I watched their heads just nodding. Because they lived it. They understood it. There's one woman, the youngest woman in that audience is about 35. She had dark hair, and I see her to this day. She's sitting off to my left. And after I said that it was worse for women back then, 50, 80, 100, 150 years ago, I saw the look on her face, but about 90 seconds later, she got up and walked out. She just couldn't grasp that. And I'm not saying it's good today, not for a moment. I'm just simply saying that look at history, it was worse back then. And for those of you that were around at the time, you understand that. I'm 51. You know, I grew up, when I was young, the ERA was an issue in Illinois. You know, that was an issue there. What was that?
It still is.
Yeah, oh yeah. But I mean, I remember there's a frontline issue when it first came around, you know, yeah, so. So that stuck in my mind to this day, how she just got up and walked out. Millennials just have a hard time understanding this. But in the past decades, and I'm going back a ways, there was no access to jobs for women, very little access to education, very struggle with place in society. It was a male come on in. Come on in. Oh, we got some youngsters, hey, all right. How y'all doing? Can y'all hear me back there?
Yeah.
Good, all right, come on in. I started reading this when I was 11, so when I have younger people audiences, I like that. I don't get that too often. Yeah. It was if society is male dominated today, it was infinitely more so back then. These women were the first or one of the few in their fields of occupation. They're the real groundbreakers. We talk about breaking ground. They're the real groundbreakers. They were surrounded by men, surrounded by critics, including many other women. Because this antiquated notion of a woman's place, a lot of women subscribed to that back then. They didn't always support each other. Women didn't always have the support among members of their same gender. That was, and I will give some examples later on. These women were not always household names. A few were, but they weren't always household names. They're women who are everyday and extraordinary. And this is something, and if I tick you all off saying this, I'm gonna apologize to begin with. Hollywood is not the example we should all be following, okay? No, just don't believe that for a second. The strongest women, to me, are the ones who are working jobs, raising families, coping with daily life, making a difference in the world and the people around them, personally and professionally. It's not some Hollywood actress. It's an everyday woman. They're the strong ones. A few of these women I talk about, they come from prominent families, not all. Some have good last names, and for that, there's been an effort to try to devalue what they did. People saying, well, they had a good last name, they came from a good family, that's why they did it. I don't buy that, because men have used family connections for decades in their quest for advancement. Why shouldn't women do the same, if they have the opportunity? And I'm gonna start with a woman that's written one of my favorite subjects I've written about. There's actually one program, different speaking program I do that I close with her. She's been my lead column. I've written 2 columns in my life on Illinois history. She's my lead column for one, and she's involved in the other one. Mary Ann Bickerdyke, Mother Bickerdyke, the greatest of all Civil War nurses in the state of Illinois. Have you all heard this name, Mother Bickerdyke? Good, all right, I'm trying to kind of break some new ground here. All right, fresh fish from the water, whatever you call yourselves. Mother Bickerdyke, as she would come to be known, was a 43-year-old widow from Galesburg, Illinois, at the outbreak of the Civil War, who practiced botanic medicine, holistic medicine. She's kind of a healer. Early in the war, late spring of 1861, she attended a sermon at her local church delivered by Edward Beecher, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, of Uncle Tom's fame, on the horrific hospital conditions for the military hospitals in Cairo, Illinois. Cairo, Illinois is at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. It was a very important Civil War port at the time. The congregation's moved. They take up a collection, have a mission of mercy, and they have Mrs. Bickerdyke deliver it. She gets there, is immediately horrified at what she sees, and goes to work as a volunteer nurse, which she would do for the next 4 years. One of the first actions she did was saw 2 hogshead barrels in half to make a makeshift bathtub, in which she washed several men, including a general. Now, we don't know if she told them to get in or she threw them in, but they got washed. That much we know. One of her first actions, I don't think people give her enough credit for this. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, which culminated on February 16th, 1862, she made 5 trips by steamer down from Cairo to retrieve wounded men and bring them back to Cairo. That's a remarkable achievement. Because you're going to Mississippi, going up to Tennessee, that takes some time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of gumption, and she had that. She just showed up on battlefields and got about her business of helping the men. They loved her. They called her Mother Bickerdyke. She called them her boys. She didn't have much use of the officers or that rank because they just got in her way, literally. They tell her what to do or wouldn't let her do something. That's why she didn't like them. After the battle, she's known for her calico dress and shaker bonnet. That's the crux of a 1952 biography of her called Cyclone and Calico. If you ever get a chance to read that book, pass. It's a lousy book. But the title really says what Mother Bickerdyke is all about. Cyclone and Calico. Could not think of a better phrase to say it. I shouldn't say it's not that bad of a book, but if you read it, you're on your own. It's really not that good. After the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, she shows up in a gray Confederate overcoat. Apparently her dress had been lost. She hits the battlefield, sets up a laundry, and starts serving hot soup, tea, and crackers to the men. A surgeon approaches and demands to know whose authority she's under. Whose authority are you under? Without missing a beat, she says, I've received my authority from the Lord God Almighty. Have you anything ranks higher than that? She just tell men to stop and help her wounded comrades. She was never an official part of the army. She had no rank. You know, but if men were walking by, she'd say, stop, come in, help your brother comrades. Right now, they need your help. They just do it. She was Mother Bickerdyke. They weren't going to say no to her. Once an officer complained to no less than William Tecumseh Sherman about what he called that meddlesome old woman from the north. Sherman liked Mother Bickerdyke. She liked him back because he didn't get in her way. And that's why he learned to do whatever. He just turned this officer, smiled, and said, I can't do anything for you. She outranks me. She would go on to organize 300 hospitals on 19 battlefields across Tennessee and Georgia. Was sent into the North a number of times on fundraising missions. She became, in some ways, certainly from Illinois, one of the faces of the volunteer nurse effort, particularly from this state, because she's the greatest one. She later moved to Kansas, where she devoted the rest of her life to veterans efforts. She died in 1901. In 1906, she was honored in Galesburg, her old hometown, with a statue on the grounds of Knox County Courthouse. The statue depicts her cradling a wounded soldier's head in her arms, giving him water. The statue is described with Sherman's 3 legendary words, "She outranks me." If you're ever in the city of Galesburg, go see the statue. It's an inspiration. It really is. Yes, ma'am.
So was she and Clara Barton together in some?
I don't know if they were really ever together very much. I think one person she was with, and she's another person I write about, I'm talking about today. Mary Safford was another volunteer angel, for lack of a better. She's called the Angel of Carol, even before Mother Bickerdyke was. I don't know how much she was with Barton, but she had people around here that worked with her that were heroes and heroines of their own. That's a good question. I've never been asked. I don't believe she was around her much. Any other questions? It's a pretty good one. Okay. I will tell you this. Of the 4 pictures I did on the front of my book, she's one of them. And we'll talk about the other 3 later today too. The other thing we'll go up, you okay? Let's talk about Mary Todd Lincoln. Very controversial figure. I heard a ooh back there. I'm guessing you don't like her?
Oh, no.
I say it because a lot of people don't. Go.
I think she's had a bad story most of her life.
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. And that's something I'm going to talk about as we go here. When I talk about Mary Todd, and I talk about her in about 4 different programs, I usually start by asking the crowd, and as I'm going to today, when I mention the name Abraham Lincoln, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? We're not being greedy here, people. You can tell me whatever you want. It's the Emancipation Proclamation. Did so at great political risk to himself. 160 years ago this year it went into effect. People don't realize how much political courage it took to do that. But yes, absolutely. Civil War, president through our darkest time in American history. Without question, the Civil War is our worst time in our history. Guided us skillfully through that and became a martyr for it. Assassination. We're the first of 4 American presidents to be assassinated. Yeah, Lincoln and Kennedy are standing alone among the 4 of them. The first one, and what a tragic end to all he did accomplish. Yeah. And you can all thank yourselves too for helping put Lincoln over the top in Illinois, because Lincoln's strength in voting in Illinois in both of his elections, 1860 and 1864, without question, was northern Illinois. The strength of Lincoln in Illinois was, if you think of a line going from Rock Island to Kankakee north, you all helped put Lincoln over the top in Illinois. We didn't. My county voted against Lincoln both times, as did Springfield. It's my county, yeah. How about you? Any questions on? You've been participating very well. No, hey, that's why I want you here. I don't want you sitting there. Any other comments? You've told me pretty positive comments on Abraham Lincoln, haven't you? But if I was going to mention Mary Todd Lincoln, I'm guessing the first thing that comes to your mind may not be as positive because of the image. The one thing I want you to take away from what I'm going to say about Mary Todd, as I do with my other discussions, too much has been made of her bad points and not enough has been made of her good points. If you take one thing away from it, that's one thing I want you to do today. And as a professional historian, I'm supposed to be unbiased. But I make no bones about it. I love Mary Todd Lincoln. I find her endlessly fascinating. I don't know how late this library open, at 8, 9 o'clock. I could stay here till then, talking about Mary Todd, and I'd drive y'all nuts. But I could do that for Mary Todd for hours. Credible research and the people know her best shows that she was well-read, well-spoken, well-mannered, unless she didn't like you. It could be a problem. She had a firecracker temper. She was very politically astute, highly maternal woman who deeply loved her children, just loved children in general. Yeah, incredible research proves this. Was she perfect? By no means. She had a terrible temper, was prone to public outbursts, was insanely jealous of Abraham Lincoln. If a woman even talked to him or looked at Lincoln, she flew off the handle. She was just extremely jealous of her husband. But she was way ahead of her time. Keep in mind, we're talking about the 1850s and 1860s. Women weren't supposed to have minds at the time. So for someone who's very well schooled politically, very well read, not afraid to express an opinion, that's not going to go over very well in mid-19th century society. She was a good match from Lincoln from an intellectual standpoint. She shared his ambition. We like to think of Lincoln as being this country lawyer who just kind of happened into things. Why he has this image, I have no idea. Lincoln was an extremely shrewd politician, a brilliant politician, and highly ambitious, as was she. Like several other first ladies, she advised him, or at least tried to. She was very well versed in policy, was very devoted to his cause, even though she was a Kentuckian herself. People also didn't understand mental illness, particularly at that time. We'll talk about that a little later on. A 2012 compilation presented it's called the Mary Lincoln Enigma, which I think is a very well suited title. You okay? You okay, Sadia?
No, I was just thinking if there's noise coming in.
Okay, whatever's best for you. A 2012 compilation published by SIU Carbondale Press, the Mary Lincoln Enigma, presented an essay from a psychology professor at Cal Santa Barbara that made a very compelling case that Mary Todd Lincoln was manic depressive. She suffered from bipolar disorder. And if you look at her personality traits, I think it's very plausible. She was a compulsive spender. She was the ultimate compulsive shopper. She might buy 100 pairs of gloves. She rang debts up like can't. We'll talk about that a little later on too. She was prone to moodiness, prone to anger, outbursts. These are consistent with elevated states of mania as well. You might make the case that she was schizophrenic based on some of the worst times when she actually suffered from hallucinations. But I've studied manic depression a little bit in my life, and I found that in elevated states of mania, victims of bipolar are subject to hallucinations at times, certainly paranoia as well, and she certainly had that. So I think the saying she's a bipolar, I think, is very plausible and very compelling. A lot of people don't realize this, as many as 14 of Mary Todd Lincoln's were in her relatives were in asylums. Another thing people don't realize, her parents were second cousins, and her maternal grandparents were first cousins. That's not unusual for her background. She came from high society of Lexington, Kentucky. Many elite Southern families tended to interbreed. That's not that unusual, but it skews the gene pool. Based on the fact she's got so many relatives with mental issues, you might say in a baseball terminology, she was born with an 0-2 count. In fact, her mental state deteriorated certainly through her life and as she kept losing her children. Lincoln's had 4 children, 3 of whom did not live to adulthood. Each one was a crushing blow to Mary as it went along. In fact, she had her husband shot sitting next to her to not do her any favors either. By 1875, she was actually declared insane, and I use saying that in a court of law, because she lived in Chicago for much of her life after the assassination. She was very nomadic. She lived in Chicago for a good part of the time. Her sole surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, institutionalized her. The hearing was kind of akin to an ambush, and it's very, very sad story. But she was judged to be insane on May 20th, 1875. She spent 4 months in an asylum in Batavia, Illinois, about 80 miles from here. It was an institution for high-end women, is what it was. She actually stayed in the doctor's quarters for most of the time. The doctor went to bat for her, and she was not that bad off. 4 months later, she was judged sane. I find this very unusual. Got her freedom back and was very nomadic for the rest of her life. Died in Springfield on July 16th, 1882 in a darkened room in her sister's home, who she'd fallen out with and patched things up later on. Very tragic, very sad figure. I don't know how anyone in Mary Todd Lincoln's later life could not have sympathy for her. But as you said, she certainly got a bad rap. I think that's summarized by a comment made by Dorothy Cashman, whose husband George was a curator of the Lincoln Tomb. Have you been to Springfield to see the Lincoln Tomb? What, most of you have? Yeah. George Cashman was curator of the Lincoln Tomb for years and years and years. His wife wrote a little book in 1969, in which she said, and I quote, "The blackest spot in our American history is the way Mary Todd Lincoln's been treated." And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'm heartened by the fact that the winds are kind of changing in her favor. When I do these talks, I'm seeing an increasing number of people who are sympathetic toward her, who have at least some type of understanding. A number of writers, Harold Holzer, one of the stars of Lincolnia today, feels that, is increasingly sympathetic. Catherine Clinton, other ones that are stars of Lincoln studies today, are really starting to understand that she had a very hard time. And I'm glad to see that. I think she has a lot going for her, and a lot to offer then and now. And like I said, if you take one thing away, too much of her bad points, not enough for good points. I will mention a couple of spending issues she had just for kind of reference. The White House has been redone and done over time and time again. In 1861, Congress appropriated $20,000 for the Lincolns to redo the White House. That's a significant amount of money at the time. She couldn't hold on to that. She ended up redoing it. It cost $26,700. Threw that away by $6,700. When Lincoln was going to be up for re-election in 1864, she was extremely nervous he would not be re-elected. Not only because she was so devoted to him and his cause, but she was afraid that if he lost it, her $27,000 in spending debts would be exposed. She ran into some financial trouble as in her later life, and certainly was worried, certainly had fears of financial ruin, which was probably unfounded. But again, what's that consistent with? Manic depression, spending habits. If you were to meet Mary Todd Lincoln today, and I'm not being facetious, if she didn't have a grudge against you, if she hated you, God help you, because you never get back in good graces. But she is very likely to sit here today to be speak a lovely Southern drawl, be very feminine, very polite, very well mannered, very conversational. I think she'd been charming to meet, and she had plenty of suitors in Springfield. Stephen A. Douglas was among them. She was a belle of every ball because of everything she had going for her. And the marriage to Abraham Lincoln, I think, is one of the fascinating marriages of presidential history. I really do. Any questions before I go on? Any comments? Yes, ma'am.
How does her bipolar disorder tie in with his depression?
That's a good point. I'm kind of glad you brought that up. An increasing number of Lincoln scholars believe that Lincoln suffered from depression, from clinical depression. It clashed at times. Even through his time in depressive episodes, he was more pragmatic and tried to keep going on, where she couldn't always do that. Their moods clashed. They didn't argue like people think they did. A lot of people like to say they had fights. Well, yeah, they fought. They were married. That's what married people do first and foremost. But it was personality conflict at times, because he could be withdrawn and she was much more emotional, explosive. What's interesting about it, he understood it though. He understood her better and was much more patient, certainly more than people at the time. Now, what that had to do with his own episodes, I don't know. But he was remarkably patient with them. I'm glad you brought that up, because I talked about that in some other talks. He suffered from depression. I believe he did. Any other? Some good questions going today. I like that. I should mention before my plug, I come here wearing the colors of Illinois State University at Normal, which is in honor of my favorite Lincoln project my favorite historical project of all time, which I did through the first year of the pandemic, Abraham Lincoln and the Heritage of Illinois State University. Illinois State is our oldest public institution of higher learning in the state of Illinois, state institution of higher public institution. Lincoln played a pivotal role in founding that university. 2020 was a miserable year for a lot of people. It was a great one for me because I got to do that book. So I got to wake up and do that every day. I was just writing like you can't believe in 2020. I know it's a bad time for all the world. It was a good time for me because this goes against my personality. I'm not a particularly social person. I'm doing this type of stuff. So not being around people, I was fine with that. And getting to write like that, shoot, that was great for me. Any other questions before I go on? I have to do my plug for ISU. I was on campus yesterday coming up here today. Anything else? Okay. Let's talk about someone else has some more regional ties. I don't say local. I know you're pretty close to Cook County here. The part of Elgin's in Cook County, am I right? Yes. Okay. So we're talking about that, yeah. Jane Addams. And she is picture number 2 on the cover. Most people only recognize Jane Addams from high school history textbooks and little else. And that's a tragedy. Because one modern writer, quote, called her the most famous American woman of the 20th century. She absolutely was. She was born in Cedarville, Illinois, about not too far from here, yeah. To a very privileged upbringing. Her father was very successful. She lived quite well as a girl. But she understood not everyone's like this. She understood that many women struggle in poverty and social degradation, and certainly at that time they did. On a trip to London, she was drawn to the first settlement house in the world for the city's poor. And settlement house, to try to describe that, I'm probably oversimplifying this, in fact I know I am. It could be used like a rehab or a culture center for poor people to come, move, live their daily lives, try to learn, receive an education, receive culture, try to enrich themselves. It's probably oversimplifying it, but I think it's the best way I can say it, because you don't see as many things like that today. But she was really taken by this. She wanted to help people. She wanted to be a doctor, but she suffered a number of issues herself. She had curvature of the spine, among other things. So she was not a particularly well person, but she wanted to do something. And I think that's inspirational right there. Adams and a college friend, Ellen Gates, started at buying a mansion on Chicago's west side, Halsted Street, which becomes Hull House, which is the two words you probably connect with Jane Addams, and most people don't know anything else. It actually is a complex that grows along because it takes in educational facilities, a gym, theater, nursery, cafeteria, art, and music, so she's big on art. It becomes a national model. People from around the nation know Hull House. They respect it. They open their own settlement houses trying to emulate her. The people that come out of Hull House that are involved in some way are remarkable. Julia Lathrop ends up being the first chief of the National Children's Bureau. She's succeeded by Grace Abbott, also from Hull House. Her sister Edith Abbott is also a top social worker. Dr. Alice Hamilton was, I believe, a research doctor. The people that are coming out of Hull House are remarkable in their own right. This is quite a story and quite a big part of American history. And Addams is driving the engine the whole time. She wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. She pushed for female suffrage, better factory conditions. She's a prolific writer, writes a ton of books and articles. 20 Years in Hull House is one of the American classics of the time. So Addams is doing an awful lot of stuff. She dies in 1935. She'd had a heart attack, I think, in 1926. She died in 1935 as the most famous woman in America. And I think it's really terrible that we don't know anything about her today. That most of us that grew up, I'm 51, we knew the name Jane Addams, we knew Hull House from a textbook. That's it. And didn't you say your daughter went to UIC?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Hull House on campus is UIC now.
Oh,
I
yes.
believe, yeah. Most of it's been torn down, but I believe it's part of the UIC campus. Anything, questions going on? Okay. The chapter I've used in my book was Jane Addams and Other Women of Impact. I love the article with that, and also talk about some of the great social workers of the time. And that's one of my most popular articles. I got picked up all over places. People just were inspired by the story of Jane Addams and want to know more about it. Another woman of the time, which I find remarkable too, Frances Willard, the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Frances Willard is a ball of energy, as a lot of these women are. And I'll tell you some statistics as we go along. Willard was born in New York. She lives in Wisconsin before coming to Illinois. Her family adopts a pledge of sobriety in 1856, and it changed her life. She devotes her entire life to temperance, which is a huge movement at the time. I don't drink, so this doesn't sound too bad to me. But we don't have, the temperance movement isn't quite what it was. But it gave her life the direction left her to prominence. She holds several teaching positions, including, she also holds the presidency of Evanston College for Ladies, which today is part of Northwestern. She's the first corresponding secretary for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, heads the publication department, which is a good thing, she's a prolific writer. She's one of 47 founders of the Illinois Women's Press Association. Temperance to her was not just don't drink. She saw the social ills of it. She felt like temperance gave women the backing, the right to protect themselves against what she called the devastation of drink, because she saw what it did. Women were beaten, money was spent, women lived in poverty, the men of the house were too drunk all the time, couldn't be a good father, couldn't be a good husband, decimated their lives. She saw the fight for temperance as giving women the empowerment and the ability not to live under these horrible conditions. It wasn't just she didn't like to drink, she looked at the social ills of it. If she were alive today, she'd be appalled at drunk driving, for example. Willard is an eloquent orator. And I mentioned a few earlier today that I've done about 175 of these over the last 10, 11 years. I usually get oohs and ahs of that one. That I don't deserve it, so I'll tell you what Frances Willard did in terms of this. At one point, she went on a 50-day speaking tour in 1874, traveled 30,000 miles annually on speaking engagements, and over one 10-year period, averaged 400 lectures a year. How's she traveling? By train, buggy, horseback. This is how she's doing it. 400 lectures a year, that's over one a day. Over a 10-year period. That's remarkable. You know, people go, you and I say, wow, Tom, you've done like, yeah, not like this. Maybe I did this in a month compared to her. You know, this is ridiculous. I mean, she's something else. But women that I've studied have incredible amounts of energy. I'll kind of digress here. A good example. Ellen Hardin Walworth, who's from Jacksonville. She's one of the original 4 founders of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Ellen Hardin Walworth had a law degree. She was a prolific historic writer. She's a prolific historical fundraiser, and she's a practicing scientist. What'd you do today? You know, but Frances Willard's like this. She was elected president of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879, re-elected every year until she died on February 17, 1898. She's from Evanston, which was and is the temperance capital of the world. Yeah. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was the progressive organization of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Half of the counties in the U.S. had a WCTU chapter in 1890, and there are 475 chapters in Illinois alone in 1900. Every little town you think of has got a Women's Christian Temperance Union chapter. Tremendous group. She's a suffragist. She promotes women's right to vote.
I was gonna say,
Please do.
Was that the beginning of the suffragist movement, was what she did?
I don't know, I don't call it the beginning, but she was one of the earliest ones that was really big into it. The first women's suffrage club, I think, was in Earlville, Illinois in 1855, I believe. She was one of the highest profile early figures in it. And again, she saw the vote as giving women the right to protect against, as she called it, the devastation of drinking in the household. Her phrase, and I'm quoting, and it sounds funny, but her phrase was, politics is a place for women. You know, she saw that women need to do this. That the Women's Christian Temperance Union was to speak out against alcohol, promote legislation against it, and organize women for the fight. Part of that goes back to suffrage.
So was she attacked by women as well as men, or?
Some to a point, because a lot of women still didn't see the need to vote or anything like that. But she had a tremendous amount of support among women, though. More, you know, so I don't think she suffered some, but not as like others. The Women's Christian Temperance Union also fought for child welfare, labor rights, penalties for sexual violence, prison reform, among others. It wasn't just about anti-drinking, but she was one of the earliest and strongest voices for female suffrage. She was president of the World Women's Christian Temperance Union from 1880 to 93. She was president of the National Council for Women in the United States in 1888 to 1890. She never forgot Evanston roots. One time said, "When I get to heaven, register me from Evanston." She's the first woman honored with a statue in the Statuary Hall of the United States Capitol. The sculptor is a woman who was suggested by Susan B. Anthony, a longtime friend. Very thoughtful lady. We doing okay here? Y'all hanging with me all right? I got 5 hours home after this, so, you know. Well, that Fox River, that's a really beautiful riverfront y'all have here too. This is great. This facility, I walked in, this looked like a shopping mall. This is fabulous here. This library had 135,000 square feet. I thought, wow, I wonder what's in there. Well, boy, you got the stuff here. It's a special place, it really is. I'm thrilled to be here in the place doing this.
Come for the exhibits.
Really? I can imagine, it's really great here. It really is. You've all treated me well here too, I appreciate that. The top photo is of Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks was the Illinois Poet Laureate, appointed in 1968, and is the first black recipient of the Pulitzer Prize. Gwendolyn Brooks was born in Topeka in 1917, but lived most of her life in Chicago. She lived in the Bronzeville neighborhood, South Side. Bronzeville had all sorts of accomplished people come out. Lou Rawls, I think, was there. Louis Armstrong lived in Bronzeville, performed in Bronzeville for a while. Marla Gibbs, who played the maid on the Jeffersons, came out of Bronzeville, among others. Brooks' mother was a teacher. Her dad was a janitor who had given up his dream of being a doctor. He was going to have the money to finish schooling and do it. Brooks had been spurned by her peers as a girl, among other things, because she didn't like her clothes, the color of her skin, and this is a quote, she didn't have good grayed hair. That's a quote, I've read that. So she's kind of spurned by members of her own race, as well as youth. She leads a very solitary and very, unhappy time. So she finds solace and comfort in reading and writing. She says, very early in life, I became fascinated with the wonders a language can achieve. I began playing with words. Few did it better. She did. She works menial jobs, begins attending poetry workshops. She's surrounded by other creative African Americans. She flourishes in this environment. She publishes Street in Bronzeville, a collection of poetry in 1943, which everything she did, she wrote through her eyes, what she'd seen, what she experienced back in Bronzeville, where she lived for most of her life. Annie Allen was a collection in 1949, which is a look at a fictional character named Annie Allen, taking her from girlhood into her years a young woman, for marriage later on. That won her the Pulitzer Prize. And I read that the day that Gwendolyn Brooks found she won the Pulitzer Prize, her electricity had been disconnected. So she's struggling. She would find more financial success later on, thankfully for her. That's all I can say. But she writes about the struggles of everyday African Americans. She wrote what she saw, what she experienced, the people she knew, the things she felt, things that they were feeling. She understood how people felt better than most. It came through in her writing. She was not one of these people, these poets or writers who talk about how much I've suffered. She talked about the suffering of other people. Maud Martha was the only novel she did. She looks at racism, classism, sexism through the eyes of a black woman in the 1920s, 1930s, World War II era. She writes things like the Bronzeville Boys and Girls, which looks at the innocence of childhood, again, even in Bronzeville, when people are struggling. The Bean Eaters, things about national social issues. She really expands on that. The Little Rock Nine, lynchings. She really takes that on as well. One biographer said that she enriches both black and white cultures by revealing essential life, its universal challenges and identities and the challenge it poses. She's writing about all of us. She's making it all better. She ends up holds teaching positions at Wisconsin, Columbia, Elmhurst, Chicago State, Northeastern Illinois, and I'm losing several others here. I mean, she's a guest lecturer, she lectures a lot of these different places. She receives over 70 honorary degrees in her life. I wonder how many people have more than 70 honorary degrees in their life. Really. She gets the Lifetime Achievement Award for the National Endowment of the Arts in 1994, I believe. In 1998, Congress declared her a living legend. Really glad Congress took the time on that one. 1998, she was a living legend at age 40, really. Congress never moves fast in our society. Later in life, she sponsored poetry competitions, which she paid for out of her own pocket. She said that my greatest interest is being involved with young people. She died on December 3rd, 2000. The Illinois State Library, one of my projects I was telling Saudi about this about 15 years ago. I received a listed grant to create a history of the Illinois State Library and library development in the state of Illinois. On June 6, 2003, our state library is named in her honor. The official name of our state library building is Gwendolyn Brooks Illinois State Library Building. That's the official name of it. She says one of the highest honors of her life. And I'm going to say this, I've written about it several different times, done several different articles on her. I'm going to say this, folks, as a writer, I think you need to know who you are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. I can tell you, I'm not a creative writer. I'm not, don't pretend to be. That's just not. I know my strengths are research, clarity, and flow. I'm not a creative writer. But the single greatest line I ever wrote, and the stars must have really aligned on this particular day for me to come up with this. I'm not patting myself on the back, I'm saying how weird it must have been for me to come up with this line. I said that Gwendolyn Brooks was a gentle spirit who provided a powerful voice in Illinois American literature. I'm very proud that I wrote that. Where I came up with that, I have no idea. But that about sums her up as well as anything. If you learn about one person today, go learn about her. You okay with me? Hang on, it's gonna be a little over an hour. You okay? We're gonna talk about a few of Illinois' top female politicians, including the first female state legislator, Lottie Holman O'Neill. And she's number 4 here. Lottie Holman O'Neill was the first female state legislator from the state of Illinois, elected in 1922. She spent close to 40 years in Springfield, 13 terms in the House and 6 terms in the Senate. She was born in Barry, Illinois, Pike County. If you know where Jacksonville is, it's West Springfield. Barry keeps going on further, over there, Pike County. Born November 7th, 1878. November 7th usually falls around Election Day. Keep this in mind, it's a recurring theme in her life. She earns her business degree, comes to Chicago, marries a businessman in 1904. She settles in Downers Grove. And what one newspaper account said her husband was of moderate means, and her home was comfortable, but not pretentious. She's deeply interested in politics and current affairs, voting rights. She's active in the League of Women Voters. Her husband encourages her to run for office. You know the phrase, behind every man there's a good woman? That goes both ways in this. Because some of the women I've talked about today had husbands who understood and supported their women. This is not very common at the time, because it's still a male-dominated world. So the fact that these women have supportive husbands helps their career along, because not all men are going to understand that. Lottie Holman's husband did. One of her heroes was Jeanette Rankin. The first congresswoman, female congresswoman in this country was Jeanette Rankin from Montana. She's elected in 1916. She served 2 terms, was elected in 1916 and 1940. Stayed around for a while, just was in Congress. The second female congresswoman was Mary Alice Roberson from Oklahoma, who was actually an anti-feminist. Talk about that. One, I would talk about Winifred Mason Huck from Illinois, is the third one. The first female U.S. senator was Rebecca Latimer Felton from Georgia, who served only 1 day very ceremoniously. And she's one of the biggest racists we ever had in the U.S. Senate. If you don't believe me, look it up. Fortunately, these women are not like that. Lottie Holman O'Neill wins election for her first term on her 44th birthday in 1922. One of many elections she's going to win on election day on her birthday. That when she gets to Springfield, there's no women's restroom on the 3rd floor. Both chambers are located. Never had a need for one until then. But over 1,000 women attended her swearing in. She works for parks, schools, disabled children, and women's work rights. This is something like the female politicians at the time are going to fight for things that have never been done before like that. Women's rights, children's rights, what they need. They understand it better. It's common to say it, they do. She's known as the conscience of the Senate, the Illinois Senate, for conservative, honest ideals. She's an honest politician in the state of Illinois. Not too many of them around. But she wins, she's elected in 1922, she serves 4 straight terms. She tries to run for the Senate in 1930, gets beat. She ends up running for U.S. Senate as an independent that year. That is the only term that she's not Illinois State Legislature between 1922 and 1962. She wins her way back into the House until 1950. Then she switched over to the Senate, wins. She serves 6 terms in. So she's in for 30 out of 40 years. She called others out for hypocrisy, selfishness, and selling out principles. She was not afraid to express her things. She's a very strong-willed, very strong personality. For someone who was rather demure and unassuming in her persona, she is never afraid to speak out for what's right and what's honest. And then we need more of that. She retired in 1963 as the longest serving female official in the nation, and died in 1967. A middle school is named in honor of Downers Grove. A number of women have things named for them, not just Jane Addams Expressway and like that, but Frances Willard has schools named after her. Frances Willard has a school named after her in Rock Island, among other places. But there's also a statue of Lottie in the Illinois Capitol Rotunda, which was dedicated in 1976. Lottie Holman O'Neill might be my favorite, probably my favorite woman, certainly one of my favorite topics I've written about. Just a fascinating individual. Loved writing about her. It's great. Originally did for the Jacksonville paper. Any questions before I do two more? You okay? Hang with me. People aren't falling asleep. That must mean something.
Yes.
Yep. Yep. I mentioned first female congresswoman from Illinois, Winifred Mason Huck. Third woman to serve in Congress. She's the daughter of William Mason, a former U.S. senator who died in his 5th term in the U.S. House. He served both chambers. He dies in office in June of 1921. There's a special election to fill the 4 months remaining on her father's term, and also a primary for the full term in April of 1922. She runs in both of them. This is kind of convoluted, but she's running twice to fill the rest of the term and get a full term herself. She spends now, people say, I have people kind of look at me funny when I say this. You might think women would be Democrats based on our image of Democrats today. A lot of these women at the time, turn-century politicians, women were Republicans. Part of that's because the ideology that I can make the case of the ideology of both political parties kind of went 180 at some point. And I'm not saying how to vote. You're not going to find out how I vote, trust me. I don't want to have a fist fight in here anyway. Winifred Mason Huck spends no money on the primary and does not have the endorsement of the Illinois Woman Republicans Club. What did we say earlier about women aren't supporting each other? She wins the election for the vacancy, but loses the primary, so she gets 14 weeks in Washington. She gets there and finds out she's not been supplied with credentials. They just aren't used to having women around. Another Illinois congressman, James Mann from Chicago, vouches for her. She gets a unanimous vote to swear and go and see her. Because at that point, she wasn't, if they were going to give her a spot, but she gets it. At the time, there's congressional custom for new members to keep their mouth shut, don't say much, don't do anything. She's not going to do this. She's got 14 weeks, she's going to make the most of it. She calls for free Philippines, independence in Ireland, because Ireland did not have independence in 1922. She looks for independence in Cuba as well. She's calling for female suffrage, which is very rare, new at the time, because the 19th Amendment passed, 1919? And that's one thing to help open the floodgates for women to get in, because of that. Lottie Holman O'Neill credited that. But she wants civil service reform again. Women are reformers. They're unashamed of that, and they shouldn't be ashamed of it. The guy who vouched for her, man, died 10 days later. So she tries running for his spot as an at-large, and she doesn't get that one either. But she lives a full life in her 13 years of life afterward. She becomes chair of the political council of the National Women's Party, a syndicated journalist, wrote for the Chicago Evening Sun, forward of the day Chicago Times. At one point, and I think this took a tremendous amount of courage, she posed undercover in a women's prison in Ohio to expose conditions of advocate rehabilitation for inmates. That sounds like something out of an old Western. But she's doing it. She's going in there undercover. That's dangerous. But she had guts to do it. She died in 1936, and I think made her mark as well. Now I mentioned most women were Republicans. One notable female Democrat was Ruth Bryan Rhodey, the first woman to serve in a top diplomatic post. She was minister to Denmark from 1933 to 1936. Minister of Denmark at the time of diplomatic rankings was just below ambassador. It's now obsolete, but she's minister of Denmark for 3 years. She is a daughter of William Jennings Bryan, the 3-time presidential nominee, who's one of only 3 men to earn the nomination of a major party ticket for president 3 times or more since 1856. FDR's one of them. He wins all 4 times. Grover Cleveland is nominee 3 straight times. He wins the popular vote 3 straight times. 1888 is an electoral college year. William Jennings Bryan runs 3 times, loses every time. Lost in 1896 to William McKinley, lost in 1900 to McKinley again. Runs in 1908 against William Howard Taft, loses worse every time, but he's still in there. He's from Salem. He was born in Salem, Illinois. Went to school in Jacksonville. He becomes a favorite on the Chautauqua circuit. The the Chautauqua people just loved him around the time. Known for his Cross of Gold speech, which really defined his career. He practiced law in Jacksonville from 1883 to 1887, where Ruth was born. Her mother, Mary, was also an attorney, and she was a remarkable lady herself. Ruth said, and I thought this is an interesting quote, "I would like to emulate my mother. She's a thoroughly feminine woman with the mind of a thoroughly masculine man." Interesting comment. They moved to Lincoln, Nebraska when she's 2 years old. William Jennings Bryan was elected to Congress in Nebraska in 1890. She follows him to Washington, and she's kind of adopted by the house as like a little bit of a mascot or a little darling or doll. They call it a sweetheart of the house. All the congressmen love her. She goes to school at Monticello Academy, which is in Godfrey, Illinois. It's now Lewis and Clark Community College campus. It also studies at the University of Nebraska. Married 3 times in her life. Kind of interesting. Marries an artist, William Levitt. They divorced in 1909, a nationally celebrated custody case. That was kind of odd in its own right. She then marries an officer in the British Engineers in 1910. He died in 1927. She ended up going with him on a variety of foreign duty posts. She serves as a nurse in Cairo, Egypt during World War I. She's traveling secretary in her father's 3rd presidential bid in 1908. There's been some talk that William Jennings Bryan and Ruth may have fallen out, at least temporarily, over her divorce and her remarriage. I think William Jennings Bryan ended up raising the kids she had. Again, divorce has not looked on very well around the turn of the century. It's been debated how, to the extent of their relationship, like they obviously patched up well enough because she was his traveling secretary in his 3rd presidential bid. So I mean, they must have got over it at least by then. Remember the energy that other women have? She serves on the professional lecture circuit for about a decade. She teaches at the University of Miami in Florida and is vice chair of the Board of Regents at one point. She also devotes ample time to filmmaking. She makes a Hollywood film and sees herself, and this is quoted, clearly saw herself as a film pioneer, doing all this stuff. She runs to the U.S. House in 1926 from Florida in a state that had declined the 19th Amendment. She loses her primary by only 800 votes to a 6th-term incumbent. She runs again in 1928 and gets in, wins a primary by 14,000 votes. Known for campaigning in her green Ford coupe. Drive around the state in her green Ford. One source said she had the high energy campaign tactics and spirited oratory of her father. She wins the general election with 65%, becomes the first female member of Congress from the Deep South. She sponsors legislation trying to get the Everglades as a national park. It failed, but later on would be named. She kind of set that in motion. She broke the father's stance on the tariff. He was anti-tariff, she was for the tariff. Tariffs has been a big issue in our country for 200 years. She fought, again, family and children's legislation. But she took a dry stance during Prohibition, and that cost her the 1932 primary. As she said ruefully, she didn't turn wet soon enough to suit her constituents. But she's not down for long because FDR, who was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. We inaugurated presidents in this country on March 4th through 1933. Appoints her as minister to Denmark. She's the first American woman to have a diplomatic body. She stays for 3 years until she marries a man in the Danish Royal Guards. That gives her dual citizenship, so she's got to resign. But she becomes an alternate delegate to the UN in 1949, and becomes kind of an elder statesman and elder expert on Scandinavian affairs. Writes extensively on Scandinavia, wrote several books on Scandinavian affairs and history, politics. She was on the advisory board of the Federal Reformatory for Women from 1938 to 54. She died in 1927, on July 26, 1954 in Copenhagen, where she's to accept the Danish Order of Merit, the King of Denmark. She's buried in Copenhagen. She's one of several women that I thought was certainly merited a lot more understanding than we have today, and I hope I was able to contribute in a lot of ways. Because as I close, these women are an integral part of Illinois history. Their stories are often overlooked. It's a privilege to write about them. I love breaking new ground, writing about inspirational characters. They certainly are. They're important, they're inspirational and role models for men and women alike, I think. It's one of the most unique and enjoyable projects I was ever on. Because we can all learn something about them today. What they overcame, and And that's something y'all need to remember too. The adversity and opposition they face makes their accomplishments much more remarkable, because they all made the world and our state a better place. And before I do what I call my shameless sales pitch, because unless it's Stephen King or John Grisham, we're not making big money doing this, trust me. I make enough to keep going. I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Is there someone you couldn't put in the book? I mean, there must have been so many.
One, I tell you one, if I ever redo this book, one I will put in is an article I did last year on Ultimate Hewlett, the first certified practicing lawyer in the state of Illinois, who received her law license at age 19, had basically written the first law against discrimination in Illinois and the nation at the age of 17. She worked with Myra Bradwell, who was a Chicago attorney. She was never able to certify to practice because of being a woman. Myra Bradwell had worked Mary Todd Lincoln's behalf, and she was kind of right arm to Hewlett's right arm to Bradwell. What's unfortunate with Hewlett, she died, I think, at the age of 23. And if I get a chance to this book, I'm putting her in as well. If I do a second edition. Yes, ma'am.
I just looked up a couple of quick facts. I thought there was a connection with Mary Todd Lincoln to this area, and apparently she was, she had stayed at the Bellevue Sanitarium, which is in Batavia, so that's close to here.
Yep.
And then Willard School in South Elgin. South Elgin is a separate town.
Is that a name for Francis?
Yeah, was named after Francis Willard. So we have connections.
Yeah, yeah. The Batavia thing, it was a dark chapter in Mary Todd Lincoln's life, but again, to understand it, you have to deal with that. Yeah, Francis Willard, fortunately, is in several places named after, like you mentioned, a school in Rock Island, another place as well. Women have been underrepresented with places named for them, and we can say they're getting it now, and that's good, and I guess it is, but they should have had a long time before. So, they certainly deserve it now, as they did then. Anything else? I tell you, I can't say this book because it's the only copy I have left. But if you would be interested in getting this book, I'll take your name and republish. I'll get it to you. It sells for $16. This is a book I talked about today, Noble Women of Illinois History, which is it's a compilation of 22 women who had an influence in Illinois history. It's a loose compilation, because it's articles I've read. If you think there should have been others written, you can write your own. That's all I'm going to say. But I talk about, as I did today, politicians, writers, activists, librarians, because what women did. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Illinois has an extremely rich history of librarianship between Margaret Cross Norton and others. Yeah. Poets, as Gwendolyn Brooks, and certainly women like Jane Addams. So that sells for $16. The Illinois State book is simply for demonstration because that's being sold by my collaborator in this. It just brought because I just want to show off my Illinois State book. Also have the Civil War in Illinois, which is a compilation of 81 articles I did on Illinois Civil War. It's part of a column I wrote for the Moline Dispatch and others for the Illinois Bicentennial. I look at every aspect of the rich history of the Civil War in the state of Illinois. That's tipping over on me, including top individuals, top leaders, the home front, Illinois' participation in top battles, the scandals that resulted from this, every aspect of the Civil War in Illinois you can think of. I'd actually do a program on that. I've done it 50 times. You can imagine. I did a couple weeks ago at SIU as well. And the third one I brought today is a booklet, Eddie, Lincoln's Forgotten Son, the second child of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln. Eddie was the second child who died before the age of 4 in 1850. You might wonder why I'm going to write about that, mainly because very few others had. But also I was able to look at the personal lives of the Lincolns. Topics very near and dear to me. His mother's mental instabilities, his father's religious views, which took shape with Eddie's death, and to look at the Lincolns before the Civil War, the White House, the assassination, and his father's place in American immortality. That's very popular with female readers. I do a separate program on that as well. The women's history book, I can take your name for $16. The Civil War is $20. Eddie is $5. I can sign them for whatever that's worth. I hope it's worth something. I round up. It's $19.95. I hope the signature's worth a nickel. At any rate. But it's been great being here in a fabulous library like this, so thank you all for having me be here.